This series is really not just about Yonah. It's entitled Yonah, Moshe, and Eliyahu versus God. It's about Yonah and his story and about where it fits into in the broader context of Tanakh and some of the themes and the ultimate message that comes out of it. We will spend a good deal of time comparing and contrasting the story of Yonah to the story of Eliyahu, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks. But the real question that I want to begin with is right off the bat, opening the first three verses. Vayidvar Hashem el Yonah ben Amitai lemor. God's word message came to Yonah ben Amitai, saying, Kum lech al Ninveh ha'ir hagdolah ukra aleh. Go to Ninveh, the great city, and declare, call out to it. Ki alta ra'atam lefanai, for their evil has risen before me. Vayakam Yonah livroch Tarshisha milifnei Hashem. Yonah rose to flee to Tarshish from before God. Vayered Yafo, he goes to Yafo, he finds a ship, he goes to Tarshish, he pays for his journey. Vayered ba lavoy mehem Tarshisha, he goes down there to go to Tarshish, milifnei Hashem, to run away from before God. There are two questions that immediately within the first three psukim we have to ask, and they're the context that will frame our study of Sefer Yonah. The first is, this is a shir in Elul because we read the story of Yonah on Yom Kippur. That's the most famous mafter of the year, perhaps, mafter Yonah. Of all stories in Tanakh, Yonah is probably the strangest to read at Yom Kippur because at the end of the day, Yonah is a story about a Navi who refuses to obey the command of God, whatever that means. However we understand Yonah's effort to run, and we're going to explain it, we're going to talk about it, but the oddity of this story to be read as the mafter on Yom Kippur is really extraordinary. And yes, I get that there's a reference at the end of the story to the Yud Gimel Midat Harachamim, or at least some of them, and we'll come back to that theme as well. But really, when you think about the basic message, Yonah is given a command and he disobeys, and God goes running after him. That's an odd story to read on Yom Kippur. And in fact, if we look at the source page, when the Mefarshim and the Rishonim try to understand why we read Yonah on Yom Kippur, they offer alternative answers. They don't talk about the Yud Gimel Midot Rachamim, or they talk about various parts of the story. For example, Rashi, famously in the Siddur, attributed to the Talmidim of Rashi, says the Hashlishi Mafter Yonah. At Yom Kippur Mincha we read the Mafter of Yonah, Mishum Tshuvat Anshe Ninveh, because it tells the story of Ninveh and their tshuva as a paradigm, as an example, as a model for tshuva. Again, that also is an odd answer because on the one hand, the tshuva of Ninveh we'll get to eventually, hopefully even today, is somewhat controversial and certainly not a paradigm for tshuva. And second of all, the tshuva of Ninveh is the third parak. So if the reason we read mafter, we don't have to read a whole book for a mafter, we often read a chapter. If the issue is the tshuva of Ninveh, so read chapter 3, or at the most chapter 3 and 4. But you don't have to read the whole book for that. So the Avudraham gives an alternative answer. And he says that the reason we read this Haftorah, L'lamed libnei alam she'en adam yochol livroch mipnei Hashem.
Right.
To teach us that a person can't run from God. That ultimately, if Yonah runs from God, and God forces him to fulfill his mission, even though he tries to run. However we understand that running away, whatever that means, but God answers him and says, you can't do that, as it says, Ana, it was a pasuk in Tehillim, Ana elech miluchacha v'ana mipanecha evrach. How can I run before God? God is everywhere. If I go up to heaven, God is there. If I go across the sea, God is there. We'll see those psukim in a moment. So my answer to the Avudraham is the same answer to Rashi, just in reverse. If that's the message of the Haftorah, so you only need to read the first two chapters. Read the chapter of the message to Yonah and Yonah's refusal, and then God chases him into the sea, and eventually he agrees. And that's the story. Again, the message of the Haftorah reflects how much of the book we read. We end up reading the entire book. which seems to reflect the idea that the message of the story of on Yom Kippur is not just his running away and not just the fact that God chases him, but the entire back and forth between Yonah and God that carries us from the beginning of the book to the end. And that's what I want to try to understand. What is it? What is the message? What is driving Yonah away from God? And what is driving God to go chase Yonah into the sea? That too is an issue we need to explore. That's the first question. Second question is just a textual oddity about Yonah. It starts right away. God said to Yonah ben Amittai. Who is Yonah ben Amittai? Where was Yonah ben Amittai? Where does he come from? Where does he live? What does he do? Who? We don't know anything about him. And the fact that this book is in Nevi'im Achronim and Treasar strengthens the question, because although not all the Nevi'im in Treasar have an introduction, many of them do. And the introduction that appears in many of the Nevi'im, for example, Yeshayahu, opening verse. This is the vision of Yeshayahu ben Amoz who saw Chazir Chazal Yudav Yishalayim, and it tells us when they lived. Asher Chazal b'mei Uziyahu Yotam Achaz Chizkiyahu Machayuda. Yeshayahu lived, functioned, and operated as a Navi in the days of the kings. Uziyahu Yotam Achaz Chizkiyahu. The Nevi'im specifically were given a message to relate to the kings of Judah or of Israel, and therefore their chronological reference point is usually the kings of Israel. Hosea, similarly, this is the Dvar Hashem Asher Hosea ben Be'eri in the days of Uziyahu Yotam Achaz Chizkiyahu, contemporary, and in the days of Yerovam ben Yoash, king of Israel. Or Amos, also, the words of Amos, where he comes from, and the fact that he lived b'yimei Uziyahu melech Yudah b'yimei Yerovam ben Yoash. And the fact that Hosea, Amos, these Nevi'im of Treasar lived in the days of Yerovam ben Yoash, and it tells us that they were in the days of Yerovam ben Yoash, strengthens the question of the anonymity of the book of Yonah, because there is only one other reference to Yonah in all of Tanakh. But it's in the book of Kings, and it pinpoints exactly when Yonah lived. It tells us in Melachim Bet, chapter 14, it says that in the 15th year of Amatziyahu, the king Yerovam ben Yoash, we just mentioned, Hosea was in the days of Yerovam ben Yoash, Amos was in the days of Yerovam ben Yoash, the days of Yerovam ben Yoash, king of Israel in the Shomron, and he reigned for 41 years. He was a bad king in terms of idolatry, but Yasharah ben Hashem, and there's much to unpack there, but not our subject. And then the pasuk says in pasuk Kafei, "Hu heshiv et gvul Yisrael milvo chamat al ad yam ha'arava." Despite his idolatry, he was able to expand the borders of the land of Israel all the way up to Levo Chamat ad yam ha'arava. He was able to successfully expand the territory of the land of Israel. Kidvar Hashem Elokei Yisrael asher diber biyad avdo Yonah ben Amittai anavi asher migat hachefer. In accordance with the word of Yonah ben Amittai, the Navi from Gat HaChefer, and the reason for it, again, the story of Yerovam ben Yoash, not our issue, but it tells us that Yonah ben Amittai lived, functioned as a Navi to the king Yerovam, and we know exactly when he lived, in the contemporary to Amos, the contemporary to Hosea. So it would have been so hard to talk about, to put in the opening sentence of the book of Yonah, that Yonah was in the days of Yerovam ben Yoash, like other Nevi'im contemporary to him. The anonymity with which the book begins is striking. Radak points this out, and he talks about the fact that it's odd. So the conclusion is, I think, and again, this is a collection of various thoughts from the Mefarshim and from a book that I'll reference in a little bit, is that the reason why the anonymity is there, partially because it parallels, we're going to see numerous parallels over and over and over again between the story of Yonah and the story of Eliyahu. And Eliyahu also begins with an anonymous, no beginning, no context, no understanding who he was, where he comes from, just Yonah makes a decree, Eliyahu makes a decree. So that anonymity is part of that parallel. but it also reflects the fact that the message of the book is not its history. It's not about who is Nineveh, and it's not about when this Nevuah was, and its historical context is less relevant to the message. The message is Yonah was given a mission, a mandate. He chooses to run away from that mandate. God chooses to chase after him. And from the beginning of the book until the end of the book, we're left with this tension. What is driving Yonah and what is driving God to chase Yonah? What's the conflict between them? But it's the conflict between them that is the core of the message of these 4 chapters, each chapter adding a piece of the puzzle. I'll show you an interesting observation that I think just highlights what I'm trying to suggest. There are 4 chapters to the book of Yonah. I'm assuming for the purpose of this discussion that we are familiar with the story of Yonah. More or less the text of Yonah. We read it every year in Yom Kippur. We're going to go through chapter by chapter quickly, but I'm not going to go through it line by line because I think more or less we are familiar with the story. But if I look at the story, it's divided up into 4 chapters. The first chapter, Yonah runs away and he's on the ship, and the ship is finds itself in the middle of a storm, etc. I would call that Yonah, the mission to Yonah and Yonah's flight. And the second chapter is Yonah in the sea. Right? The entire story is Yonah inside the fish. I don't like to call it a whale because it doesn't say it's a whale. It's a fish, but it's also a prayer. Right? The entire chapter is a prayer that Yonah offers to God. So if I look at the first 2 chapters, they are part, and it ends. If I look at the end of chapter 2, Vayomer Hashem ladag v'yaket Yonah Eliyahu. Yonah is thrown back up onto dry land, and then the story begins all over again. For a second time, God says to Yonah, Kum lech al Nineveh. So the chapters of the book of Yonah are very neatly divided. Chapter 1 and 2 is the mission first time around, and he runs away. Chapter 3 begins with a repeat of the mission to go to Nineveh, and this time he's forced to comply, and how it plays out. So I have 2 chapters on the first mission and 2 chapters on the repeat. But if I separate them out and I look at them piece by piece, in chapter 1, Yonah faces the sailors on the ship. And in chapter 2, the entire chapter is devoted to a prayer between Yonah and God, or prayer of Yonah to God. In chapter 3, Yonah faces the people of Nineveh and the tshuva of Nineveh. And in chapter 4, Yonah sits outside of the city in a conflict and a conversation with God about the concept of Racham. So again, I have the same parallel. Yonah in his relationship to those around him, in this case the sailors, chapter 1. Yonah's relationship with God, chapter 2. Yonah's relationship with Nineveh, those around him. Yonah's relationship with God, chapter 4. And again, the constant back and forth places Yonah at the center of the story and tells us this story is about some conflict that's driving between Yonah and God. We need to understand what that is. That's my introduction. Having said that, let's jump into the story. And I'm sorry for rushing, but I want to try to get through, and essentially should be a much longer bunch of material in a shorter period of time. I apologize for that. But at the end, I'll leave time for questions. So if you have questions, write them down. And after the shears at the end of the hour, I'll be happy to take questions. So let's go back to the beginning of the story. Chapter 1. So Yonah runs. And the first obvious question that we ask, that the Mefarshim ask, that anybody reads the book asks, Yonah runs. How do you run from God? How does a Navi run from God? Navi can't run from God. Navi speaks to God. A Navi has a relationship with God. A Navi communicates with God. How can a Navi think for a moment that he can run from God? And if you look at this text from Tehillim that I quoted briefly a moment ago, it's a very powerful text. I think in some ways it's influenced by the story of Yonah. Ana elech miruchecha va'ana mipanecha evrach. Where can I run from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Vayakam Yonah livroach tashisha milifnei Hashem. And then the psalmist goes on. Imesak shamayim shamata. If I go up to the heavens, there you are. If I go into the depths to the Sheol, where Yonah will describe himself in chapter 2, there you are. Esak kanfei shacha eshkina ba'acharit yam. Even if I go into, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, I go out to the sea to run. There too your hand can lead me, can guide me, and your right hand will hold me. So what is Yonah doing? He's running from God. He's running into the sea. How does that work? So here the classic answer, and I think it's really the only answer that you can give in terms of the context of understanding Yonah, is that he wasn't running from God. He was running from the mission God sent him on. The Mechilta reflects this in a very interesting way. Mechilta writes, Mechilta is one of the foundational midrashei halacha. Mechilta, it says, Teda she'ein hashchina niglet b'chutz la'aretz. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, does not reveal itself outside of the land of Israel. Meaning, the way it's understood by the Rishonim, Kuzeri especially, is that this is a concept of prophecy. You can't have prophecy outside of the land of Israel. The presence of the Shekhinah, which drives the power, the energy of prophecy, can only be in the land. And the proof, says the Mechilta, is Vayakam Yonah livroach tarashisha milifnei Hashem. Asks the Mechilta b'chim milifnei Hashem u'bareach. How can you run away from God? Is he running from God? That's not possible. Ela amar Yonah, elech li lechutz la'aretz makom she'en hashchina niglet. I want to leave the land of Israel because then God can't chase me. He can't run after me. He can't speak to me because there's no nevuah in chutz la'aretz. That's the language of the Kuzari. Lo barach Yonah ela makom nevuah. He ran away from the place of nevuah, erroneously thinking that if he can't hear God's words, then his mission ends. He can't fulfill the mission, whatever the consequences of that are. And we'll see that in a moment. Ibn Ezra highlights this with a very interesting textual nuance, which he points out, and this has been discussed many different places, that there's a difference in the language, the subtle difference in language between mipnei and milifnei. If you look at the Tehillim, it says, Ana mipanecha evrach. You can't run from God, from his presence. Mipnei Hashem. Mipnei Hashem is everywhere. You can't escape it. What Yonah was running from, it says, was Vayakam Yonah livroach mi lifnei Hashem, not mipnei Hashem. He wasn't running from God. He was running from standing in the presence of God. And lifnei Hashem is a reflection of a much deeper sense of revelation of God's presence, says the Ibn Ezra. And he gives various examples to that idea. Eliyahu describes himself as standing before God, Elokei Yisrael asher amadati lifanav. In Bamidbar Lamed Bet, it talks about the land of Israel as the land which is lifnei Hashem, which is in the presence of God. The story of Reuben and God, of God. And therefore what Yonah was doing was he was running, and twice it says milifnei Hashem, he was running from the Shekhinah, from the ability of God to communicate and speak to him, as if God, he can't hear God's words, he doesn't have to fulfill that mission that he doesn't want to do. Now, that doesn't answer the question of why he doesn't want to go on this mission. That's the big question. He won't answer until chapter 3 or chapter 4. But it does tell us that what's going on. Yonah is running from the communication of God. And that has a very specific connotation. That has a context. That's called, in halachic terms, kovesh nevuah, a prophet who receives a message from God, a prophecy from God, and refuses to fulfill it, refuses to do the mandate he was given, that has a very halacha context. That's exactly what Yonah was doing. He was leaving the land of Israel so that he did not have to, or in his erroneous thought, God can't communicate with him till he realized that God can communicate on the sea just as well as he can in the land of Israel. And that will come to in a moment. But his immediate thought is that he does not want to fulfill this mission. And the Gemara has a term for that. A Navi who refuses to fulfill his mission is called, in the language of the Talmud, kovesh nevuato, somebody who suppresses his prophecy. Now that's a crime. A Navi who suppresses his prophecy, the Mishnah says, mitato b'dei shamayim. It's a capital offense, and he is to be put to death by the hands of heaven. Meaning, and the Gemara spells this out, lest there be any ambiguity. Hakovesh nevuato, a Navi who suppresses his prophecy. Example, kagon Yonah ben Amittai. Yonah ben Amittai is guilty of just this, of refusing the prophecy, the mission of the prophet. That, the Mishnah says, is mitato b'dei shamayim. He deserves the death penalty, and he deserves to be killed by God. And so here's the next part of the question. Instead of taking his life, instead of ending Yonah's life because he's guilty of a capital offense, what does God do? He doesn't kill Yonah. He chases Yonah. He chases after him. He goes running Yonah goes to the sea. God runs after him with the storm. Yonah goes into the bottom of the boat. God will run after him. Yonah, right? Instead of taking his life, there's a conflict, there's a give and take between God and Yonah in this story. Yonah's trying to run away because he knows that he doesn't want to fulfill this mission, and therefore he knows what he's guilty of. He knows he's guilty of kovesh nevuato. In fact, when we get to the story, which is next in chapter 2, in the end of chapter 1, suddenly Yonah finds himself on the boat, and he finds that on the boat, God can still engage with him. Yonah is on this boat, so God's chasing after him. And God sent a giant storm to destroy the boat. And then the description here is very, very poetic. It kind of takes us from the bigger, broader picture of the sea and narrows our focus down to Vayiru Malachim. The sailors were afraid. They each cried out to their gods, and they started to empty the boat of all of their belongings, and to make it lighter. And Yonah, who knew exactly what the storm was about, Yonah went to the bottom of the boat to fall asleep. Now, ask yourself a question. Yonah is not a stupid person. He's a very smart person. He's a Navi. If a boat's in the middle of a storm, what is the worst part of the boat to be in? The bottom of the boat. Right? A boat at sea in the bottom is in a storm-tossed storm. Right? You don't want to go to the bottom of the boat because that's the first place to fill with water and you'll drown. And there he goes to sleep. He comes to him and he says, "What are you sleeping here for? What are you doing here? Call out. We're all calling out to our gods. You call out to your God. Maybe we don't want to perish." So they decide to throw lots for him. And the lots will determine who's the guilty party. That's fascinating. Doc asks the question, why did they assume there was a guilty party? Why didn't they just assume it was a storm? Storms happen at sea. They had to assume that somebody was at fault. So Doc says fascinatingly, he says, only their boat was in the storm. All the other boats were calm. They could see all the other boats around them. They were all calm. Only this storm was very pinpointed. Okay. And no surprise. Yonah's not surprised. They said to him, where are you from? What is your job? What land are you from? What people are you from? They're completely confounded by this miraculous storm that's come to take out Yonah. And Yonah seems very okay with it. He's not bothered by it. He's sitting in the bottom of the boat. And he answers, classic non sequitur. Vayomer alehem, Ivri anochi, I'm an Ivri. Ivri is a very mysterious word. He's not Israel, he's not Yehuda, he's Ivri. Ivri is typically a term you use for a landless people. Like the slaves are Ivri. Right? We have it in the very positive context. We talk about the Ivri, we talk about the Hebrews, but originally in Tanakh, Ivri was almost a pejorative. Moshe describes Bnei Israel as or God of Israel as the God of the Ivrim, because they're a landless people. He says, "V'anochi, et Hashem Elokei hashamayim ani yareh, asher asat hayam v'et hayabasha." I fear a God who has no boundaries. He made the heavens, he made the land, he made the sea, he made everything. I fear God who's not bound to a land or a people. And for a moment, think about it for a second. Listen to what Yonah is saying. Yonah is saying that Yonah ran to the sea because he was running away from the land of Israel in order to escape the prophecy. And here he comes before the sailors and he says, I serve a God who is not bound by the limitations of borders and boundaries. Here is God in the middle of the sea. The more Yonah runs, the more God runs after him. Yonah is not speaking to the sailors. Yonah is speaking to himself. Yonah is acknowledging that this is all about him. So they said to him, what do we do? And Yonah said exactly what we've said all along. If somebody who refuses their prophecy, they deserve to be put to death by God. He says, throw me into the sea. Now, when Yonah asked to be thrown into the sea, Yonah is not expecting the big fish to come and save him. Yonah fully anticipates that by throwing him into the sea, that will be the end of Yonah's life. And that's exactly what he expected. In fact, Chazal say this in a very profound way. Say Mechilta, Rabbi Natan Omer, Lo alach Yonah ela le'abed et atzmo bayam. Yonah went into the boat, to the bottom of the boat, knowing that God would chase him and eventually it would cost him his life. But that's what Yonah understood. That was his crime. He was guilty of a crime for which the punishment is mitaved shamayim. He was fully willing to accept that. And so he says to them, throw me into the sea. But the irony of the story is they pick him up, they throw him into the sea. The people on the boat are astounded because suddenly the storm is over. They start to fear God, and they brought all kinds of offerings, etc. But the irony of the story is, the moment we start chapter 2, instead of allowing Yonah to drown to punish him for his crime, God saves him. God sends this great big fish to swallow Yonah and to save his life. The fish wasn't there to punish Yonah. The fish was there to save Yonah. And we'll see that in this tefillah. It's very clear. The more Yonah runs from God, the more God chases him and the closer he gets to God. That's the irony of the book. And when you start to look at chapter 2, and the entire chapter is Yonah's tefillah, in the belly of this fish, right? God enabled by Yaman Hashem Dag Gadol, Livlo at Yonah, this fish swallows Yonah. Yonah bimed hadak shlosha yamim, for 3 days. Vayitpalel Yonah el Hashem Elokav. He prays to God from the belly of the fish. Now, what he prays, if we were theoretically going to kind of construct his prayer, I'm imagining it would start with Chatati, Aviti, Pashati. I sinned. You gave me a mission. I disobeyed you. I disobeyed your command. I disobeyed a direct nevuah. Kovesh nevuato. God saved my life. Do tshuva, kapara, something, right? It's Shem Kippur at Mincha. I would anticipate that this tefillah should be about Yonah's mistake. Yonah acknowledges his mistake, and Yonah decides to do tshuva and go on this mission to Nineveh. But that is not the case. There is not a word in this entire prayer about tshuva, about the mission to Nineveh, about the fact that he made a mistake. Nothing. This tefillah reads like a parak of Tehillim. Vayomer, he says, Karati mitzara li Hashem, from my distress, I called out to God. And he answered me. Mibeten Sheol Shivati Shamata Koli, from the womb of Sheol, the grave, from the depths of the grave, I cried out. You heard my voice. You cast me into the depths, into the heart of the sea. The currents surrounded me. The waves passed over me. Yonah is describing his being thrown into the sea and what happened to him in the storm-tossed sea. I said to myself, I'm banished. I'll never see God again. I'm done for. And yet, being saved now in the belly of this fish, I will once again see your sanctuary. Water encompassed me all the way to my soul, meaning I was about to drown. The depths surrounded me. I was drowning in the water. The reeds wrapped around my head. I was done for. I was tossed to the ends of the mountains, down into the depths of the earth. And from literally, you raised my life out of the pit, God. When my soul was fainting, I had no life left in me. I was drowning in the sea. And you remembered me. Now my prayer comes to before your sanctuary. Those who regard worthless vanities, who worship idols, though their vanities will abandon their faithfulness. Right? Those sailors on the boat, they're singing thanks to God, but they don't really understand what that means. Ani, I, with a voice of thanksgiving, I will bring an offering. I will fulfill my vow. Yeshuat el Hashem. God saved me. Not a single word about Nineveh or the message or the mission to Nineveh. Vayomer Hashem ladag, vayaket Yonah liyabasha. So God tells the dog to, very harsh word, to vomit Yonah back onto dry land. Okay? So Yonah ran from God. God ran after him. And now he's back on dry land. So now I anticipate what? I anticipate Yonah to say, okay, God, I made a mistake. You sent me on a mission. I didn't want to do it. I ran away. But now I learned my mistake. I learned that you can't run from God's presence, even from prophecy. You have all kinds of agencies by which to convey your message. I'm here and I'm willing to go. That's what I would expect. But that's not what happens. Beginning of chapter 3, Vayi dvar Hashem el Yonah shenit lemor. For a second time, God comes to Yonah and says to him, because he was thrown back on dry land, meaning back to the land of Israel. So now he's back where he started. And now God can talk to him again. And what does God say to him? Exactly what he said to him the first time. Kum lech el Ninveh ha'ir hagdolah. Go to Nineveh, the great city. And you'll say to Nineveh exactly what I tell you to say. This time, this time Yonah has no choice. He got up and he went to Nineveh exactly as in accordance with God's command. So it's fascinating. Is Yonah convinced of this mission? Or isn't he? Like, is Yonah now a willing partner to this mission that he was conveyed, that he's learned his lesson, or no? There are two indications that Yonah is not, he's forced to go, but he's not a willing partner. He's not convinced. He's not going willingly. There are two indications of such. One is the text. After God sees that they do tshuva and he relents and he spares them, beginning of chapter 4, Yonah is very angered by this and he calls out to God and he says, this is exactly what happened when I was on my land. This is exactly why I ran away to Tarshish. I knew that you would forgive them. And therefore, God, take my life. I'm done. I'd rather die than live. Which is why Yonah went to the sea in the first place, which is why Yonah went down to the bottom of the boat, which is why Yonah said to throw him into the sea. He does the mission, he does exactly what God tells him, but he doesn't do it willingly. The other indication that he's not a willing partner in this mission, he's doing it against his will, is in a subtle text. If you take a look at the comparison between the description of the mission in chapter 3 and the description of the mission in chapter 1, it's a very subtle difference that emerges. In chapter 1, God says to Yonah, Kum, get up, Lecha Ninveh, go to Ninveh, the great city, and call out to it. Doesn't say what to call out, just says call out to it. Ki altara atam lefanai. God shares with Yonah why. He shares with him the nature of this mission. There's a evil in this land, and they need to do tshuva. Their evil has come before me, like by Sodom. And Yonah says, I'm not interested. V'yakam Yonah leaving. Chapter 3, Vayidvar Yonah, Hashem Yonah, Shenit. God comes to Yonah again and says, Kum lech al Ninveh, get up, go to Ninveh, Ha'ir Agdolah, the great city. And you will say to Ninveh what I tell you to say. Almost like Bilam. You're going to say the words I tell you to say. It's almost like God says to Yonah, you don't have a choice here, but I know that you don't want to go on this mission. You're not convinced that their evil needs to be rectified and addressed. And therefore, I'm telling you, like Bilam, you're just going to say the words that I tell you to say. And he goes. And we see at the end that he was not interested in going. Meaning Yonah's forced into it. He has no choice. He does it. But he's not a willing partner. And so much was the whole effort to convince Yonah, chapter 1, chapter 2, the effort on the boat to convince Yonah that this is the right thing to do. Yonah still says, no, I'm not convinced. And so Chazal make a very powerful statement or offer an insight into this word shenit. God spoke to Yonah a second time, or again, if you will. Says the Gemara in Yevamos. Shenit lemor. God spoke to Yonah a second time. Shenit divra imo shchina. Shlishit lo divra imo shchina. God spoke to him a second time, but not a third time. Meaning, this was the last prophecy Yonah will ever receive. He's given the mission, finish it. But your job as a Navi is over. That's a very powerful statement. That basically says that in the end, in the argument, Yonah is unconvinced. As we see here in chapter 3, he goes, but he's not convinced. And God says to him, you know what? You have now ended your usefulness to me as a Navi. And therefore, Shenit, v'lo shlishit, you're done. This is it. This is the last Nevuah you will receive. That whole story that we read in Malachim Bet, that's before this event of the book of Yonah. It's fascinating. There's only one other Navi that I know of in Tanakh whose refusal to heed the word of God led to his dismissal from his role as a Navi. Let me repeat that again. Only one of the Navi in Tanakh that I'm aware of whose refusal to not to go on the mission, but to buy into the mission, his refusal to identify with the mission God has given him led to his own dismissal as a Navi.
Eliyahu.
And that's Eliyahu. That's exactly right. That's Eliyahu. There's a reason why the constant parallels between Yonah and Eliyahu keep coming up. When Eliyahu was standing in that cave, we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, that cave where Moshe saw the attributes of mercy for the first time, God says to him, Malach hapo Eliyahu, what are you doing here? Eliyahu's response is, Kanoki neti l'Hashem Elokei tzvaot ki azvu bitcha b'nei Yisrael t'mizbechatecha arasu v'neviyecha gumacharev. I was zealous for you, God, for your people abandoned the covenant, and they've killed the Nevi'im, and they've abandoned you, God. And I alone have been left, v'veterni levadi, v'yivakshu et nafshi lekachta, and they seek my life, they seek to destroy my life. I was zealous for you, God. But this moment, and we're going to unpack this whole chapter in a couple of weeks' time, ultimately leads to God's response, which is, okay, Eliyahu, go back, and here's a series of things that you have to do. One of the things, you have to appoint a new king, and you have to appoint a new etc. And the last thing you have to do is V'Elisha ben Shaphat me'avel mocholat timshach l'navi tartecha, and you will appoint your successor Elisha to be a prophet in your stead. You're done. If you can't understand what it means to accept the midot rachamim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, unpack that story in a few weeks, right? Then ultimately your job as a Navi is done. And so when Yonah refuses, God says, fine, so appoint a successor. There's another point of intersection between Yonah and Eliyahu. Which brings us to the last piece we're going to look at today, which is chapter 3. So Yonah, unwillingly, but nonetheless, he's not embracing the mission, but he does it because he's commanded to do so. He finally goes to Nineveh. Nineveh was a giant city, it was a great city. Nineveh was a 3 days walk to go from one end to the other. Yonah enters the city. He enters 1 day's worth, meaning he gets to about a third of the way into the city. 40 days more, and Nineveh is going to be overturned. He walks into the city, a third of the way, turns around, says to the people, 40 days you have until Nineveh will be destroyed, turns around and walks out. That was he was told to go to Nineveh, and he was commanded to convey a message. He walks in a third of the way, conveys the message, and then leaves. In other words, there's no effort by Yonah to convince the people of God's presence, of God's truthfulness, of God's message, of the fact that they have 40 days before Nineveh is going to be overturned, right? There's just, goes in, a day's journey, says what he had to say, 5 words, and leaves. Because he doesn't want the people of Nineveh to do tshuva. Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The last thing in the world he wants is for them to do tshuva and to rise, to conquer and conquer Aram, and to become the rising power that will eventually exile the northern kingdom. This is not right. That's exactly who he's dealing with. So he says these 5 words and he leaves. And then we have a picture of what the result was. People of Nineveh, they believed in God. Not in Hashem, but in God in the generic term. Some of the Mepharshim ask, why were they so quick to believe? So maybe some of the sailors from the boat had come to them and told them their story. So whatever it is, Vayikru Tzom, Vayilbushu Sakim, Migdolam Yad Ktanam, they called for a fast, and they dressed in sackcloth, from the king down to the lowest of the people. Then he describes the details. This all the way up to the king of Nineveh. He got up from his throne, he took off his cloak, and the king dressed himself in sackcloth, and he sat on ashes. Vayazek vayomen b'Ninveh, and he made a decree in Ninveh, and he said, "Mitam hamelech ugdolav lemor, ha'adam v'beima, bakar v'atzon, al yit'amu me'uma." Man and beast, cat and cattle and sheep, nobody is allowed to eat or drink umayim lo yishtu. Vayitkusu sakim, they'd cover themselves in sackcloth, man and beast, hadam v'beima. Vayikru elolim b'choskar, they called out to God loudly. Also reminiscent a little bit of the story of Eliyahu and Har Carmel, where he taunts the prophets of Baal and says, maybe your God is sleeping, why don't you scream a little louder? And they returned, they did tshuva from the evil ways and from the violence that was in their hands. That's what they were telling them to do. Maybe, perhaps God will relent and spare us of this calamity. So that we shouldn't perish, which is exactly, by the way, the same language that the people on the boat used. We should not perish. God saw their deeds, for they relented from their evil ways. And so God relented from the evil that he spoke to do, and he did not do so. So 40 days came and went, and Nineveh did not get destroyed because the people did tshuva. At least that's what the text says, right? At least that's what we understand, right? What the people in Nineveh understood is not ever clear, but the text tells us that God relented because he accepted their tshuva. Which leads to the immediate question of the sincerity of the tshuva of Nineveh. We're talking about a nation of Gentiles, we're talking about the Syrian, the capital of Ashur. Is this a sincere tshuva? And here the Mefarshim and the Midrashim are divided. Here the question, the picture is not so clear. On the one hand, we have a whole host of sources in the Mishnah and Tainis and the Gemara and Tainis and Sefer Chovot HaLevavot that seem to reflect that this was a very sincere tshuva. Not only was it a sincere tshuva, it was even a kind of paradigm for tshuva, and that we should emulate some of the practices of the people of Nineveh. Mishnah, for example, in Masechet Ta'anit, has a whole description of the ceremony that we are supposed to undergo or go through when there's a famine, when there's no rain. And there are a series of fasts that we're supposed to decree when there's no rain. And in these fasts, Seder Ta'aniot Ketzad, what are we supposed to do? So first of all, they take the Aron out of the shul, and they bring it into the center of the city as if the exile of the Aron is going into exile. And they have this big communal prayer in the middle of the court of the city. And the Zaken Shebehem, the elder of the community, says to them, Divrei Kivushin, words of reproof, words of rebuke, words of Musar. And what does he say? He says, Achainu, my brethren. By the people of Nineveh, it doesn't say that God saw their sackcloth and that God saw their fasting. It says, it says that God did not punish them because he saw their deeds and he saw that they had turned away from the path of evil. And Yoel says, tear your hearts, not your clothes. This was sincere. We have to follow that paradigm. Gemara Tainis similarly says that what is Hamas Sheba Chapehem? What does it mean that they relented from the violence that was in their hands? It So there are two opinions, but one opinion says, "Afilu gazal merish ubanao bibiram kakeh kol bira kulam machzir marish lebalav." Not in accordance with Jewish law, but their perception was that if they stole something and they used it and they built a structure with it in order to return it to their masters, to their owners, they needed to destroy the entire building that they built with this beam that they stole. That was the extent to which they did tshuva. Chovot HaLevavot further says that on the fast days we should wear, our external clothing and jewelry should all reflect the mindset of this tshuva. Shanot malbushav v'tachshitav lavot simanei charata, to reflect remorse. And we learn this from the story of Ninveh. Vayitkasu sakim adam b'beima. They wore sackcloth, man and beast. So on the one hand, there are many sources that seem to reflect the idea that this was a very sincere tshuva. And I showed you the opinion of Rashi that we read this on Yom Kippur because it's a sincere tshuva, as a paradigm for us, as an example. On the other hand, there are elements in this tshuva that are just too sarcastic and too extreme for it to be sincere. And the symbol of the insincerity, the symbol of the opposite perspective, which is to see this entire episode of tshuva as a parody, is the role of the animals. When the king of Nineveh makes a decree and he says, Adam ba'beima bakar ve'atzon al yit'amu me'uma. Man and animal, cattle and sheep shall not eat or drink. I understand people need to do tshuva. The people should fast. You're going to fast. You're going to force your animals to suffer fasting as well. And it's emphasized, right? And then they cried out to God loudly. What does it mean, cried out to God loudly? And this emphasis of Hachamas Shebakapehem. So the opposite side of the perspective is the Yerushalmi that says, Shimon Lakish, that says, Tshuva shel Bamayut. This was a tshuva of trickery. People of Nineveh. The animals did tshuva, the animals of fast. That's absurd. The animals were used as a way of them calling out to God, as a way of them saying, you know what, we're going to force God to forgive us. How? Listen to what Rabbi Lakish suggests. They put the calves inside the house, and they put the mothers outside in the barn, in the pens. See, and similarly with the horses, and the nursing calves with the mothers, nursing mothers for their yearning for their calves. When Elin gain minhacha, the Elin gain minhacha, and these were mooing, and these were braying from one side, and these were crying from the other, and they tortured the animals. Dafka nursing mothers, taking away their young from them and forcing them to yearn for them as if tsar balechayim. And then they called out to God, and they said, "In let mitrachem alenan lenan menachamin alehon." If you don't have mercy on us, we shall not have mercy on them. Now, God, let's see you carry out the judgment against us, and then we'll carry out the judgment against the animals. That's how the animals got mixed into this, according to this story. And that's a tshuva that is completely false. That's pure parody. That's pure mockery of everything that tshuva represents. To that tshuva, Yonah says, I will have no part. And so we read the next verse. Vayera Yonah agdola vayichalo. Yonah was evil for Yonah. It was embittered Yonah to the point where he was angry, to the point where he was done. Vayitpalel Hashem vayomar, and he turns to God in prayer and he says, Ana Hashem. This is exactly what I said when I was still on my land. Therefore, I ran away. If you want to answer the question, why did you run away? Here's the answer. Because you, God, are merciful and slow to anger and abundant in kindness, and you would forgive them. You would not only forgive them, you would even forgive them. This parody, this mockery of tshuva, you would forgive them. I don't want to see this. This tshuva, I will have no part of. That's exactly what Yonah says. And that, by the way, is also a similar story to Eliyahu, but we'll come to that in a couple of weeks. Yerushalmi says of Yonah, in this, bring us to the end of our shir today, Koveshet nevuato ki Yonah ben Amittai. We started with this statement of the Yerushalmi, that Yonah was guilty of suppressing the prophecy, of not agreeing to go. And then the Yerushalmi quotes, I love this opinion because it's expressed by Rabbi Yonah. Says Rabbi Yonah, in defense of Yonah. Rabbi Yonah says in defense of Yonah, Yonah ben Amittai navi emetaya. Yonah ben Amittai was a navi, a prophet of truth. And he could not tolerate this parody, this falsehood of tshuva. And we're going to unpack what that means in the next couple of shiurim. But I want us to understand this reference, besides the fact that it's expressed by Rabbi Yonah, which I just think is ironic, the notion that Yonah is driven by this intuitive, internal drive of emet, of truth, that doesn't allow him to resonate with him the mission to Nineveh. And when the mission to Nineveh was fulfilled, he denies it, he rejects it because he knows it's false. And Yonah, in the core of his being, is a Nevi Emet. And we haven't answered the question of who is Yonah and how he comes to this. But this reference to Emet is extraordinary. Why? I want to go back to and this will end, I want to go back to the verse, the beginning of chapter 4. Yonah bitterly complains that God is too merciful. And his mercy even extends to this group of this parody of tshuva. And he says, this is why I ran away. Because I knew that you, God, are merciful. Now read this sentence. For you are gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abundant in kindness, and would relent this evil. You know the 13 attributes of mercy. We say them every yontif. We read them in the Torah. We read them on fast days. They roll off our tongue. Hashem, Hashem, kel b'chum b'chanun, erech hapayim, v'rav chesed, ve'emet. The next word after v'rav chesed is ve'emet. Yonah leaves it out. Yonah leaves out the word emet. It belongs right here, in that space. Belongs the word emet. Yonah leaves it out. Yonah says, I'm driven by emet. Yonah ben Amittai navi emetu. And in truth, this tshuva is a parody. How dare you forgive them? You got a merciful, you got a compassionate, you got a slow to anger. Great. You're going to be slow to anger and compassionate against the evil of Nineveh? Yonah says, I represent truth. You, God, represent something I can't apply in this particular instance. And that's the source of the conflict. Here, that space where the word emet belongs, is the core of the vikuach, the core of the conflict between Yonah and God. Conflict that will lead us now over the next 3 weeks to explore where these 13 attributes of mercy come from, the story of Moshe in the cave. What is did the Nevi'im understand the attributes of Moshe? What do they represent? What do they mean? And from there, we're going to explore the story of Eliyahu and his relationship to the attributes of Din and Rachamim and how they play out in his story. And then, Bezrat Hashem, in the last year, we're going to come back to this chapter and we'll finish our study of Yonah in chapter 4 and pull it all together. I've entitled the shiurim number 1 today, Yonah versus God. Next week, Moshe versus God. The week after, Eliyahu versus God. And the 4th week, we'll discuss Mafta Yonah, and I've entitled that In God's Defense. So, if to come away with the full picture, you have to stick with us till the end of the last year, because if you drop out in the middle, you're going to come up with a lot of questions. And like the story of the Apikoros who complained to the rabbi that he became an Apikoros by reading the Abarbanel, because every time he would sit down on a Friday night and read the Abarbanel, he would read all the questions that the Abarbanel had, and then he would fall asleep, and he never got to the answers. And from all the questions, he became an Apikoros. Says if you leave this year before you get the answers, you're going to end up with a lot of questions without a lot of answers. We're going to resolve them, B'ezrat Hashem, when we come to the last shiur, so you have to stay with us, B'ezrat Hashem, through there. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it very much. And I will take an opportunity now if there are any questions. I have not been watching the chat, so I don't know what's on the chat, but if there are any questions, be happy to try to address them.
Rabbi, this was wonderful. Thank you. I noted in the chat that the expression of God speaking to somebody, Shenit min Hashamayim, is also in the Akedah. Right? The Malach comes to Abraham
right,
and tells him not to stop. That's the second time. Right. Now, I'm not saying it has the same meaning as you were saying here, that this was the second and final, that there wouldn't be any others. Obviously, with Abraham, it's a different story. But
it may not be a different story.
Well, actually, I'm realizing that because the next chapter is the burial of
Abraham's life.
Right.
One thing left is for him to bury Sarah and then move on to Yitzchak.
Right.
Interesting.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting observation. Okay. Any other questions?
Which, of course, we read on the Yomim Noraim also.
It's also true. Actually, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, yeah, it's a lot. All right.
What about the idea that Yonah is a completion of the Noah story?
So there is a connection between Yonah and Noach. There are a lot of parallels between Yonah and Noach. There's a very good article about that in Hebrew in one of the publications of Shivat Har Etzion called Be'er Miriam. It's not a direction that's going to help us in this approach, because it's going to take us in a different direction, but there is a lot to be said for the parallel between Yonah and Noach. On one foot, I will say that it's a completely different approach to Yonah. But on one foot, I will say is that Noach is the greatest example we have of a tzaddik who's an ordinary tzaddik. Meaning he's not a superhuman, he's not an unreachable person, he's got his faults, he's got his foibles, he's an ordinary tzaddik. Yonah is also an ordinary Navi. He's got his foibles and he's got his... so that's another approach to the story of Yonah, but one that's going to take us in a different direction.
Rabbi, thank you very much. So what about the opening? Openings, Rabbi Silber, a teacher, wonderful teacher of mine, he always said, look at the beginnings, look at the endings. So we look, as you started at the beginning, and it starts out and it says, his name is truth. This is where he comes from. His name is truth. So really our expectation of him, at least mine would have been, if we're looking at it, with a clean slate, would be, okay, this is great. Let's see what happens. The man of truth or comes from truth. And wow, to us, at least, falls right in his face and runs away. So how do we deal with that? Why does it open up and say, okay, guys, here he comes, guy with truth in his legacy, truth should come from his mouth and right on his face?
So I will answer two questions. Number one, I'm not 100% sure we would have made a bigger issue out of the word emet in his name had it not played such a big role in the story.
Okay.
Now, sometimes our information is in hindsight. The
Mhm,
fact that he's driven by a drive of emet that leads him to reject rachamim, emet and
mhm,
din associated with each other,
mhm,
leads him to reject rachamim. In hindsight, now we can go back to his name and say that's exactly what Rabbi Yonah the Yerushalmi is saying. Yonah ben Amitai, Navi Emet. You see that he's driven by a foundational belief and trust in the concept of emet. But that's exactly what leads him into conflict with God. I want to make something very clear. I'm not suggesting, that's why I didn't want to go to the Yonah direction, the Noach
mhm,
direction.
mhm,
I'm not suggesting that he's an ordinary person, he falls flat on his face and he fails. On the contrary, you have to be a Navi of Eliyahu's caliber to be able to engage, and of Moshe's caliber, to be able to engage with God and fight with God. This is not a struggle between ordinary people. God doesn't chase after every ordinary person to the depths of the sea to convince them of that
mhm,
he's right.
mhm.
This is because Yonah is a Navi. Yonah has been devoted his life to the Jewish people. The whole story in Malachim is that he is a Navi of the king. You have to be of that depth to be able to then say to God, okay, God, in this case, I can't understand what you're doing, and therefore I say no. Right? But ordinary people don't have that authority.
Mhm.
You have to be at that level, of that caliber, to be able to say,
Okay.
I like to use the word level in Madrigas in terminology of spiritual efforts, but in the case of a Navi, that's truly what it is, right? Yonah is a Navi, but therefore he has the right to turn to God. Like Abraham argues with God, Yirmiyahu has moments where he conflicts with God. We'll see some of those next week. Yonah has the moment where he says to God, "This is my way of saying I don't understand. Why would you possibly forgive the people of Nineveh?"
So then, Rabbi, one more follow-up, if I may. Is it a clash of titans, or is it an ordinary prophet versus God? In other words, so is it the clash? Is it a titan versus a titan who has the right to even cross swords with God? It's got to be somebody of a high caliber. So that's what I'm asking. Is it
Look,
ordinary
Yonah is
versus
certainly a
God, or is
titan.
it
God is
titan
not.
versus titan?
I'm not. It's not a conflict of equals, but Yonah is certainly a titan in that regard. I will reserve judgment to answer that question till the last class when we look at God's answer to Yonah, and compare it to God's answer to Eov. So I want to hold off answering that question, but stay with us for 3 weeks and we'll get to it.
Whoever asked about Yonah and Noach, there's also in Judith Klitzner's book about subversive sequels in the Bible. That's her first chapter, Yonah and Noach.
Okay, very good. There's a hand raised. Stephen Altman has a
Yes.
hand raised patiently.
Why did Yonah involve the sailors in his death? Why didn't he just cast himself into the sea? Why involve
That's a good question.
other
I'm not
people?
sure. That's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer to it. Maybe he thought that in his initial thought was that he could run away, that he could escape the prophecy. I don't think he anticipated that there would be a storm at sea. I think when the storm started, he went to the bottom of the boat. Right? When the storm started, he realized the storm was for him, so he went to where he could to be drowned first, and then that would spare the rest of the people on the boat. I don't think he anticipated that, like that. If he anticipated that God would chase after him, he wouldn't have gone in the first place. His initial flight was because he didn't want to hear the message.
Right, but clearly the sailors were very hesitant. They rowed for shore. They did not want to be involved in his death. They did not want his blood on their hands. So why didn't he just jump?
Yeah, I'm. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a good answer, other than the fact that you're not allowed to do that. So, I don't know. It's a fair question. I don't have a profound answer to it. So I have to leave it at that.
I think the sailors are a message to us, not to Yonah so much, but more to us, that ordinary people can turn around and show their own heroic and moral standing.
It's certainly a good way to look at the, powerful way to look at the story of the sailors. They are, even after Yonah tells them what he's done, and Yonah says to them to cast me into the sea, they refuse to do so. They try. The next verse is that they tried every which way they could to right the ship until they had no choice. They're very hesitant to do that. That's it. Yeah, story of the sailors too. There's the tshuva of the sailors, and there's the tshuva of the people of Nineveh, both of which have contrasted with Yonah's own personal story. So,
Well,
okay,
it's really appropriate.
thank you all. I appreciate your time, and B'ezrat Hashem, we will see you next week.
Thank you.
You look so much happier and more relaxed in
Thank you,
Israel, I
Rabbi.
have to tell you. Lucky you. Enjoy
Rabbi.
every minute.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good night.
Okay.